This week begins Bamidbar, the fourth book of the Torah, the book we know in English as Numbers. Literally in Hebrew it means in a wilderness. And yet we know it as Numbers because, like many descriptive titles, the first part at least is all about numbers. The part we would read this week in the synagogue is about the census, about how many Israelites there were finding themselves in the wilderness, in the desert. There were a lot. We don't usually imagine it that way. We imagine a few families and a few camels. That's what our children's illustrated Bibles tell us. But when we look at the words of the Torah, we realize actually there were almost 2 million people, an estimation, but that's what it says. Yet, the question that should really animate us when we approach the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, is not how many Israelites there were, but rather who the Israelites are. Who are they at this moment when we meet them, when they're in, as the book begins, the second year after leaving Egypt? They're Egyptians. They've always been Egyptians. These are people who, until very recently, thought of themselves just like anyone else in Egypt. And yet, pretty quickly, they were told not only were they not like everyone else, they were enslaved, and pretty quickly after that, they're told they need to leave. They're leaving the only home they've ever known to follow this prince-turned-prophet who could have been Pharaoh, we know as Moses, into the desert which represents death and decay, the desert which is so far from the Nile River which provides the lifeblood of the society they know. They're meant to undertake a journey to a foreign land, which they've never seen, they don't really know anything about, and where they have no connections to. It's their history, a distant history even for them, of ancestors who came to Egypt probably 500 years prior. And they're told they need to embrace this history, this identity, this religion and culture which to them would have been quite foreign. They're reformed into tribes which probably they didn't observe for a long time, and they're told they need to embrace a religion which probably many of them had forgotten about. It had been generations of being fully Egyptian, and now everything changed. Hundreds of years of affluence and assimilation in Egypt had given them absolutely zero preparation for what it means to be in the desert, in a wilderness. But, of course, they're glad to escape slavery and subjugation. But it doesn't last. Bamidbar is so focused on their tensions, their complaints, their struggles, that it really makes us focus in on who they are at this moment. Moses wants them to join him in this quest to reclaim Canaan, to reclaim the faith in a single God that Abraham promulgated so many years prior. Moses wants them to embrace the alienation and isolation of the wilderness. That's where he was comfortable. This is a man who at 80 had lived most of his life in that wilderness, neither Egyptian nor Israelite. He's practiced at it. They are not. And as a result, most of them just want to go home. Not home to Canaan, home to Egypt. Bamidbar, as we'll discover as we read it in the coming weeks, is a book all about what it means to be left in between. Sinai, of course, is literally that empty space in between Egypt and Israel, and that's more than purely geographic. It's symbolic of who the Israelites are and of where they're going. Most of them seem to want to return to Egypt. Not to slavery, of course, but to that life before slavery, before a new Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. They're filled with nostalgia and sentimentality for the luxuries of Egyptian life. They certainly aren't keen on Moses' mad mission to invade the land of Canaan. Them, a poorly armed, poorly organized group of barely ex-slaves who know nothing about Canaanite religion or culture. That alienation and those tensions, which Bamidbar is so much about, are really important, and they're especially important for us at this moment. Like our protagonists, the Israelites, we've also entered into an unexpected crisis. Things that we took for granted have been taken away without warning. Our ability to see our loved ones, to go about our daily activities, and of course, at least if you ask a rabbi, our ability to come to synagogue. One impulse that we'll feel is that desire to try and return to what we've lost. But as we'll see as Bamidbar plays out, it's not that simple. You can't ever go home again. The older generation, who are fully and completely Egyptian, they never managed to accept the new mission Moses has charged them with. They rebel, they complain, they threaten the success of the whole project. It's only once a new generation is born into the wilderness itself, that they're able to embrace the directive of the entire Torah. Move forward, move ahead, onto something different and better and unknown. We need to model ourselves after those visionary young leaders who we will meet in the course of the rest of the Torah, after Joshua and Caleb, after those who had the drive and imagination to embrace a new future. Not a future that was simply a restoration of what was, not going back to Egypt, but rather an affirmation of what could be in Canaan. So much of our lives will look different after the wilderness we're in now, after our experience of COVID-19. Our economies, our families, our communities will all be radically changed by the alienation and the isolation and the wilderness of life right now. On the other side, people will be missing. Routines will be disrupted, but new things will sprout from the wilderness and from the alienation of this time, and we need to foster them and encourage them. We can't go back to how things were, but we can move forwards towards a better future. That takes leadership, of course, and imagination, but most importantly, it takes courage. Bamidbar is so much the story of the tension between going back to Egypt or forward to Canaan. And it's not all roses either way. But the path forward, the path to Canaan, is the only one that's feasible. Because going back to those palaces and palanquins of Egypt is really an illusion. It takes the Israelites a long time to learn that, 40 years. And I'm sure we'll learn that sooner. Once we do, we should embrace those words which Moses will eventually charge Joshua with. Joshua, who represents that generation raised in the desert, thirsty for the unknown future into which he's leading the people. When Moses designates him as the leader of the Israelite clans, this ragtag group of people who left Egypt a generation ago, Moses charges him with two simple words, chazak ve'amatz, be strong and be courageous. So too, as we stand in the wilderness and we look towards the time ahead, let's look forwards and not backwards. We need to embrace the mission of sanctifying the new normal, rather than bemoaning the previous paradigm. If the Israelites could do it, they who lost everything they knew, then we can too. And the good news is, it probably won't take us 40 years to cross this desert. Shabbat Shalom.